13 researchers moved into a Viking longhouse in the middle of a Danish winter. They wore wool tunics and leather boots. They cooked over an open fire the way Norse families had cooked for 400 years. Meat on iron hooks, smoke rising free into the rafters. They slept on wooden benches against the walls, the way everyone inside that structure had always slept. After 7 days, every single one of them had measurably damaged lungs. The house was performing exactly as designed. Thus, that is the part no account of Viking engineering has ever fully explained. Not because the evidence is missing, but because the evidence changes what the story is. The longhouse kept people alive through Arctic winters, without glass windows, without chimneys, without insulation as any modern builder would recognize it. That achievement is real. The physics behind it is documented, measurable, and in many respects more elegant than what replaced it. But the system that held warmth inside also held something else inside, by the same mechanism, using the same walls, the same sealed vents, the same carefully managed fire. And the people who built those houses, generation after generation, adjusted the vent every winter night, knowing exactly what both sides of that adjustment cost. To understand the cost, you have to understand what the system was built to do and how, precisely, it did it. Archaeologists across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland have mapped longhouse remains down to the grain of each turf block, and the thermal conclusions hold without exception. Walls 2 meters thick at the base, packed with layers of soil woven together by dense grass roots, containing the same still air pockets that give modern insulation its R value. Air that does not move does not carry heat away. Earth that is bound by root systems does not shift or crack under the pressure of frost. And these were not crude approximations of insulation. They were insulation, arrived at through centuries of trial and outcome, formalized into a building tradition that spread from Norway through Iceland to the furthest Norse settlements in Greenland. The central hearth ran the length of the building. On stone-lined pits beneath the fire absorbed heat during burning and released it slowly over hours after the flames faded. Thermal mass working exactly as thermal mass works today in passive solar design, storing energy during input and releasing it during deficit. In regions where trees were scarce and peat replaced wood, the slow burn of peat provided steady, low-intensity heat for far longer than split timber could, requiring less attention through the night and consuming less fuel across a winter that stretched from October through April. The hearth did not just warm the air, it warmed the ground, which warmed the people sleeping close to it, which reduced the metabolic energy each body had to spend on maintaining its own temperature, which reduced the food required to sustain the household through the months when no food was being produced. At the eastern end of the longhouse, our livestock occupied a section of the same structure where humans slept, worked, and a single cow produces approximately the same sustained thermal output as 3 electric space heaters running continuously. A household with 4 or 5 cattle sharing an enclosed volume with 30 humans was generating an enormous and entirely free thermal contribution that required no fuel, no management, and no maintenance. It ran as long as the animals were alive and breathing, and the floor plan was designed to extract maximum benefit from this. Animal areas sat slightly lower than the human living space, so warm air rising from livestock bodies drifted upward and forward into the areas where people gathered. No pipes, no fans, no mechanism of any kind. Gravity and convection did the work, guided by the geometry of the floor. Snow was not fought. It was allowed to accumulate against the exterior walls, banking against the turf until the entire lower section of the building was encased in one of the most effective natural insulators on Earth. Snow crystals trap still air between their lattice structures in exactly the way turf walls do. Immobile air, unable to carry heat away, creating a thermal buffer between the heated interior and the open winter. What looked from outside like a buried structure was, from the inside, and a house that had acquired an additional layer of protection simply by being left alone. Entire Viking settlements could disappear beneath snowdrift, leaving only thin columns of smoke and narrow entrance passages visible against the white. Beneath that frozen exterior, the thermal system continued running. The snow sealed the last remain. The building became more efficient the deeper the winter buried it. The system worked. This is established, repeated, celebrated. What is less celebrated is what the system required in exchange. A longhouse had no chimney. The fire that heated the space, cooked the food, dried the clothes, and organized the social life of the household burned at floor level in an open pit. Smoke rose from that fire, gathered and had two options: seep slowly through the thatch over time, or escape through a small adjustable opening cut near the ridge. In winter, that opening was kept nearly closed. And the thermal logic was exact. Every gap in the roof was a gap in the thermal armor, and warmth escaped through gaps faster than fire could replace it. So the vents stayed shut, and the smoke stayed in, and the warmth stayed where the warmth was needed. The building did exactly what it was designed to do. And in doing exactly what it was designed to do, it trapped inside every molecule of combustion product that the fire. What those molecules did to the bodies underneath them has been measured. Not inferred, not reconstructed from analogy, not estimated from saga literature. Measured by researchers at Aarhus University who instrumented 2 reconstructed Viking-Age houses and inhabited them for 13 winter weeks in the early 2000s, monitoring carbon monoxide levels, fine particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and the respiratory function of the people inside. In real time, continuously, across the full experimental period. Period-accurate clothing, period-accurate wood species, period-accurate cooking methods. The equipment recorded what the air was actually doing inside an operating longhouse while human bodies were living inside it. Carbon monoxide near the fireplace averaged 16 parts per million. Across the living area at head height, daily exposure fluctuated between 5.5 and 22 parts per million, depending on fire intensity, fuel condition, and the direction of wind pressing against the roof from outside. The World Health Organization's threshold for a safe 24-hour average exposure is 6 parts per million. Participants in the study exceeded that threshold, briefly but consistently, every single day. Fine particulate matter. PM 2.5, the fraction of smoke small enough to bypass nasal filtration entirely and embed directly into lung tissue, reached 3.4 milligrams per cubic meter near the fire. The WHO guideline for safe daily PM 2.5 exposure is 0.015 milligrams per cubic meter. The measured concentration inside the operating longhouse was more than 200 times that figure. After 1 week, measurable deterioration had occurred across every participant, regardless of prior respiratory condition, regardless of whether they smoked tobacco, regardless of age. White blood cell counts rose, indicating systemic immune activation. Then exhaled nitric oxide, a direct biomarker of airway inflammation, increased across the group. Lung function declined in ways that pointed specifically to bronchial injury. The researchers concluded that health conditions in the Viking-Age were shaped directly by wood smoke exposure. These were volunteers with monitoring equipment and a university standing behind them. They could leave whenever the conditions became unbearable. They chose to stay for the study. After 7 days, their lungs had already begun to show the early markers of chronic injury. Viking women and children did not choose. They did not leave. The men went out. They worked fields, felled timber, made trading runs to seasonal markets, sailed open water for months at a stretch. Their exposure to longhouse air was interrupted daily by time spent outdoors, breathing unfiltered winter air, which, for all its cold, was clean. And the interior of the longhouse was a specialized environment that people with freedom of movement could partially escape. Women managed cooking, food preservation, spinning, weaving, and the full continuous physical care of young. They remained inside the structure through nearly every hour of every winter day, positioned close to the fire because the fire was where the cooking happened and where the light was. Close to the fire was exactly where smoke concentration was highest, and where PM 2.5 readings spiked during stoking, where the CO reading climbed whenever fresh wood was added to the coals. Children were there alongside them. Infants spent their first months of life inside this air with no capacity to choose otherwise. The skeletal record holds this pattern. CT scans of 15 Viking-Age skulls from Västergötland, analyzed at the University of Gothenburg and published in 2025, he showed pathological bone changes consistent with chronic sinus and ear infections in nearly every individual examined, adults who died between 20 and 60 years of age, across the normal survival distribution of the period. Sinusitis rates at the Viking-Age urban settlement of Sigtuna, recovered from burial sites and examined across multiple independent studies, reached 95% of the adult population. And female remains from the Birka burial sites showed sinus disease at higher rates than male remains from the same population, 100% of the female against 68% of the male sample in one analysis. The differential tracked the differential in indoor exposure, with a precision that was not coincidental. The people who spent more time inside the longhouse carried more evidence of what the longhouse air had done to them. The evidence was written into bone, which survives. The tissue it affected most directly, the soft, wet interior surfaces of airways, did not survive. The full record is invisible. What remains is enough. The ceiling is where the system reveals its own logic most starkly. Measurements above the interior ceiling in the Aarhus reconstructed houses showed carbon monoxide concentrations dramatically higher than in the occupied zone below. The ceiling functioned as a barrier, not a perfect one, but a functional one, trapping the most toxic accumulation high enough above the living space that the people beneath it were not killed outright. The separation held most of the time. When the adjustable vent in one of the reconstructed houses faced a specific wind direction, the pressure dynamics across the roof failed entirely, and combustion gases were driven back downward into the living space with no upward path available. The people inside responded by moving lower, a pressing toward the floor, where stratified air maintained marginally better conditions, and clustering near the fire for light and warmth, which placed them directly in the zone of highest concentration. The space offered no clean position. Every location available inside an operating winter longhouse was a compromise between cold and smoke, and the compromise never fully resolved in either direction. The vent is the most precise artifact of what Viking builders understood about this system. And it was not a fixed hole, it was adjustable, designed to be opened and closed based on observed conditions, calibrated against both the smoke building inside and the temperature falling outside. Open it wider, and the combustion products escaped cleanly, and the heat followed right behind them, and the interior temperature fell fast enough that sleeping children woke shivering. Close it tighter, and the warmth held, and the CO accumulated, and the air thickened through the night. And someone was making that decision every evening, in every longhouse, across every winter of the Viking-Age. The decision they kept making, generation after generation, was to close the vent. That is not ignorance. That is a hierarchy of priorities, encoded into a mechanical control and exercised nightly by people who understood both consequences and had already determined which one to absorb. The Aarhus study identified something specific about when exposure was highest, not during the steady burning, but during active fire management, stoking coals, adding fresh fuel, adjusting the arrangement of burning wood. Those moments produced the sharpest CO spikes, the densest particular clouds, the most intense short-term exposure. Whoever tended the fire most actively received the highest cumulative dose. In the labor structure of the longhouse, and continuous fire management through the day and through the preparation of meals, was the work of the women and older children who remained in continuous indoor proximity to the hearth. The distribution of exposure was not uniform across the household. It tracked the distribution of labor exactly. The people with the least freedom of movement inside the space, across the longest hours of the longest season, had the highest exposure to the most acutely dangerous conditions it produced. But this is what the longhouse was. Not a solution to winter, but a negotiation with it. A negotiation that was never fully won on either side, and that exacted its payment in the tissue of the people who lived it most completely. Every element that addressed one problem generated the conditions for another. The turf walls that blocked wind also blocked the outward dispersal of combustion products. The closed vent that held heat in also held CO in. And the livestock that generated supplemental warmth also generated additional carbon dioxide, additional organic particulates, additional humidity that interacted with the wood smoke chemistry in ways that compounded the respiratory burden on the humans sharing the space. And the communal density that made the thermal system viable, 30 or 40 bodies generating heat inside a single enclosed volume, meant 30 or 40 respiratory systems contributing to and breathing from the same degraded air column across months of continuous winter occupation. None of these effects were separable from the effects that made the system work. The warmth and the harm were not two separate outputs of the system. They were the same output. I'd experienced from two directions simultaneously, and no adjustment existed that could be made to one without immediately affecting the other. Soot accumulated on the wooden beams across years and decades, and this accumulation is described in most accounts as a structural benefit. And it was. The soot waterproofed the timber, sealed surface cracks, drove away the insects that accelerated rot, and extended the structural life of the roof supports that held the entire building together. And the same soot was the visible residue of the chemistry the people beneath it were inhaling into lung tissue year after the beams lasted because of what coated them. The airways of the people below absorbed the same chemistry at the cellular level in tissue that does not survive 1,000 years in Scandinavian soil. The timber can be dated. The damage to the lungs beneath it cannot be recovered. The record that remains, the sinusitis in bone, the inflammation markers, the gender differential in skeletal disease, is a partial account of what a complete account would show. 60 winters inside a longhouse, 60 winters of adjusting a vent against the wind in the dark, of tending a fire in an enclosed space, of breathing air that exceeded every threshold, modern medicine uses to define chronic harm, not by margins, but by multiples, consistently, across every season. The sinusitis that left structural marks on bone was not a series of acute events. Now it was the accumulated consequence of a calculation made correctly, made rationally, made in the only direction the available conditions permitted, and paid for incrementally across a lifetime, in tissue that could not be recovered between winters because the next winter always came. The longhouse kept people alive. That is what it was built to do. The same properties that made it thermally effective, the sealed walls, the closed vent, the shared enclosed volume, made it biologically costly. And these are not two separate verdicts delivered from separate vantage points. They are a single description of what the structure actually was. A machine for managing one category of harm by accepting another, operated with full competence by people who understood both sides of the management problem and had resolved every winter that the cold was the faster and more certain death. The warmth was real. The cost was real. The engineering that produced both was the same engineering, running as a single integrated system, and the people who ran it for 400 years across the North Atlantic understood it as such. What remains is a question the longhouse itself cannot answer. Whether every system designed to hold something in, warmth, comfort, safety from one specific harm, also holds something else in by the same logic, as an inescapable consequence of the same wall. And whether the distance between the Viking vent, calibrated nightly against competing harms in the dark, and any control we exercise today over the environments we inhabit and the trade-offs we choose not to count, is as large as we prefer to believe.